Hello, welcome to this Grey Doors webinar on the future of business travel post-COVID-19. I'm Dave Bishop, Chief Commercial Officer at Grey Doors Group. We're a UK-based travel management company. I'm currently sat in my home office in Buckinghamshire. I'm joined by my colleague Aman-Paul Karimi from our consulting department. We did a webinar some months ago about the implications of a no-deal Brexit on travel. But of course, the priority right now is people's health and doing what we can to help our health services and governments cope with combating this virus. We urge people to continue to follow government guidelines regarding social distancing and, of course, to stay at home. However, as the rate of new cases starts to decline, there's been increased scrutiny and focus on what levers and tactics will be for businesses as they formulate their strategic plans. With an eye to his work in assisting clients with their travel programs, Aman has been keeping abreast of the market. Aman, what can you tell us about the impact of COVID-19 on our industry?
Yes, it's fair to say the impact has been on an unprecedented scale, so much so that the word unprecedented has never been used so much. Over 90% of the world's population is currently under some form of travel restrictions. What we're seeing in terms of the impact that that's had on airlines is that they're currently trending on a global scale at around 25% occupancy. The hotels are a similar level, and most of that is based on repatriation and cargo. And as you can see at the moment with the transferring of PPE and vital medical equipment. So we've not yet seen that bottom out, but we're close, is what we're being informed. However, the WTO warned that the global economy could shrink by as much as a third in 2020 as a result of the coronavirus. While IATA, which is the International Air Transport Association, now expects the global airline industry to take in terms of US dollars, 314 billion hit in revenues in 2020, which is approximately 50% of the decline on the revenue from last year. We want to look forward. We've all heard the doom and gloom stories. So in order to forecast the impact of coronavirus on the travel industry in general, what we can perhaps do is look towards other events and what impact they've had on the global flight capacity. So I've picked out 3 particular events which have had what I have seen and what data has shown is to have an international scale impact on travel. So that was September 11th, 2001, the SARS epidemic in 2003, and the ash cloud in 2010. As you can see from the graphic, you'll see that each had a noticeable knock on flight capacities during that period. Most notably, you will see that from 2011 and 2003, which coincides with both the impacts from September 11th and also from the SARS epidemic, you'll see that the impacts are a 30% decline in air capacity, and it took 3 years to recover from. But clearly, this is of a larger scale because, as I've mentioned before, it's currently trending towards a 70% decline. So if we look towards the ash cloud, that again had a 30% drop in worldwide air capacity in 2010, and the period in which that ash cloud had restrictions was actually just shy of 2 weeks. So we're more looking at months and this is on an international scale. However, the decade following those disasters has shown, as you can see from the graphic, unprecedented levels of growth. So on the positive scale, you can see the long-term durability of the travel industry and the ability to bounce back. And I predict that again.
So kind of here in Europe, the September 11th and ash cloud had a larger effect on us than SARS. But back then, the economy was in a very different shape to now, and the effects were not felt globally. For example, in 9/11, this came on the back of the bursting of the tech bubble 2 quarters earlier. So we could see demand was already slowing down. The same with the ash cloud, because obviously post 2008 there was, we'd seen a marked decrease in economic activity and also travel. But the macroeconomic conditions now are very different, given both the stabilisation packages that we've seen put in place from governments, and I'm sure we'll see kind of further stimulus packages from governments as they kind of look to jumpstart the global economy. So while the outbreak has been a global one, the reaction certainly hasn't been coordinated. Therefore, we think that some economies may recover better than others. There are a few mitigating factors here. Governments pumping in fiscal stimuluses across economies, timing and effectiveness of a vaccine, effective integration of public health measures with economic activity, and many others. At the moment, various governments have taken different approaches for managing the health and economic crisis. For example, in South Korea, it's in aggressive testing, contact tracing using people's mobile phones and surveillance, and mandatory quarantines, which are helping to isolate virus clusters and dramatically slow the spread of the outbreak. In the United States, we've seen cases and deaths accelerate rapidly amidst containment responses that vary state to state and at local levels. And the US now has the highest number of confirmed cases in the world. McKinsey has attempted to predict the recovery based on various scenarios related to health response and economic policies of each country. You can see this on the graph. On the x-axis is the virus spread and public health response, and on the y-axis is the effects on economic policy responses. It was predicted at the start of the outbreak that there would be a V-shaped recovery. Our view in the UK is that we predict recovery to be somewhere between B2 and A1 on the graphs, as you can see. This is due to the government's speed of response and will of course have an impact on the speed at which business travel demand will return. That demand will of course run at different speeds for domestic and international travel, which will follow broad economic growth more closely.
It is expected that recovery mindsets from an economic perspective will start shifting between 45 to 90 days post the peak of the virus. So the best case scenario for the UK was that businesses will start to resume steadily from June, as the graphic on screen illustrates. What you're seeing is the hotel availability trends that we're noticing from a month by month perspective from each country. And you'll see that it starts to pick up in the month of June.
So on the airline side, we've seen Jet2 announce its intention to open flights back on June the 17th, and TUI have also followed suit in the leisure space. In addition, Emirates have indicated their willingness to start opening flights from the 1st of May to certain destinations worldwide. A key bellwether for the global travel market is going to be the demand on the biggest revenue route, which is London, New York. Currently, flight capacity is at 10% of pre-COVID levels, which are entirely repatriation flights.
So clearly we're in a state of the unknown at the moment. There's two schools of thoughts on this. You can be a pessimist or you could be positive. And so I'll start off with the positive points. From a positive perspective, remember that there were crises before this one, and the travel industry, as we've shown, was recovered and in fact returned back to an unprecedented levels of growth. And in this case, the machine isn't broken, it's just on pause. What we must also note is the stimulus packages from various governments across the globe. For example, in the UK, we have the furlough scheme, business interest rate cuts, and more favourable loan options. And in regards to travel in particular, EasyJet have been provided a government loan of $600 million. In the US, you've got the CARES Act, which provided a direct $50 billion in grants and loans to the airline industry. Now, that could be an advantage for those when we go out of recovery, which airlines have benefited from government loans over others. That remains to be seen. And of course, there's the element of pent-up travel. Unlike the other crises, which were a shorter period of time, we have a considerable amount of travel that we will see coming out, bouncing back immediately from this. There's also been the impacts of oil prices, which have dropped to $15 per barrel, which is at a 21-year low. We should see airlines benefiting from that when we recover. From a pessimistic viewpoint, those would argue that the global economy in general was slowing pre-COVID-19. If you recall, China had recorded its first reduction in GDP in over a decade. There was trade rows involving the US and China and Europe. There was, within our own shores, we had the issue of Brexit. And it was predicted that the the global economy would start to cool. And as we have heard already, there is an anticipation that globally we will be heading into a recession. For example, in the UK, we're forecasting a 7.2% reduction in GDP, which is the largest reduction since the 30s. In addition to the economic constraints, we will see new regulations in regards to visas and health screening. We've also seen unemployment being predicted to go as high as 16 to 20% in the UK and US in particular, compared to the 3.5% levels it was pre-COVID-19. We also have to look at the behavior aspects. Companies are now getting used to using video technology for meetings, for example, using Zoom and Teams technology. Looking towards previous crises as an indicator shows that it can take up to 3 to 5 years for economies to recover. And this is, of course, of a bigger scale. So if you're pessimistically looking at it from that viewpoint, it could take longer.
So no matter what your view on the level of growth, it's fair to expect the travel industry will change. I'm going to highlight 6 key areas that are going to affect travel going forwards. Firstly, behaviour. It will take some time for traveller confidence to resume, maybe until a vaccine is available, which is certainly going to be relevant for international journeys. Hotels are going to benefit from a bottleneck of events that have moved to 2021, so the football Euros, the Olympics and large conference events. But we predict that domestic markets will be the quickest to recover, as we've seen in China. We can see that there was a reduction in 70% on flight schedules year on year on the 17th of February, which is the peak of the virus. But on the 23rd of March, that had improved to only a 38% year-on-year decline, which is a clear sign of recovery. Legislation. So post 9/11, we saw increased security checks at airports, and we could well see health screening added. Tracking apps like those in the Far East are being tested by governments here, which could see people denied entry into public areas without an app. Capacity. Suppliers will cease to exist or merge. We've seen the end of Flybe, and we're also seeing various other airlines seeking government support. Elsewhere in Europe, Norwegian Airlines is trying to secure a government lifeline worth up to $270 million, and Alitalia has recently been bailed out. Government support. So it's tough times for Middle Eastern carriers who rely on state support, which has been greatly hit due to the reduction in tourism and oil prices. US airlines were benefiting from a strong domestic economy and are therefore in good shape. If Frontier and Spirit, who have complained that the CARES grants have benefited larger airlines more, can ride out the downturn, they'll be well positioned to benefit from domestic travel surges. In addition, those countries that don't support their national airlines may see those airlines really suffer in terms of lack of competitiveness compared to those airlines that have received strong government support. Availability. There could be less seats on planes. We've seen airlines close off middle seats or entire middle sections. There could be less flights on routes. Airlines will either reduce or remove routes as loss leaders are no longer sustainable, especially those used for connecting flights internationally. There could potentially be less airports. This may see the closure of certain airports if costs will greatly increase to satisfy increased screening and less flights to gain revenue from airlines. This could also have a knock-on effect on the infrastructure, e.g. hotels around airports. And finally, price. Don't expect price reductions. We're likely to see lower capacity due to closing of suppliers, less inventory, i.e. using smaller planes or closure hotels, and the lessons learned from previous major events such as 9/11, where hotels in particular sold stock to the OTAs at considerable discounts, and they haven't really recovered in terms of yield. Instead, we predict we'll see suppliers make greater use of value adds such as ancillaries, if, for example, on airplanes, Wi-Fi, expedited security, speedy boarding, loyalty scheme enhancements, and also waive cancellation and change fees to encourage you to fly with them.
Clearly, we await for the borders to open back up. We are guided by government legislation. After that point, here are our tips for what travel managers can do to ensure that they're best positioned for facilitating travel post-COVID-19. The first and most important step is to engage with travelers. We saw after September 11th, US domestic flights fell at twice the rate as they did on international flights, and that's because their travelers were quite frankly frightened to get back on a plane again. So my recommendations here is to form traveler focus groups, get an understanding of what your top travelers your key road warriors pre-COVID-19 what their position is on traveling again. Arm yourself with more information regarding their personal health, and particularly anybody suffering from respiratory issues. You also need to greater inform yourself, if you haven't done already, on the duty of care responsibilities for businesses. The law stipulates that businesses have to offer the same level of care as they would for somebody working at a home office when they're traveling abroad. So we advise strongly to identify ahead of time any potential risks for a planned journey. Advise against those risks to your travelers, the ones that you can't control, and mitigate against those that you can. For example, when traveling abroad, you may look to allocate road transportation from preferred suppliers and restrict any use of local transportation that's being chosen by the traveler themselves. You also need to make aware of your travelers their responsibilities. They have what's referred to as a duty of loyalty to your policy. So you need to make sure that travelers are informed of any new policies that you have in place and have signed off to that effect. You also need to make sure that that business confidence is there for travel. So my advice is to go to your travel management company and gain information in regards to the previous trends in your business for travel, and report back internally to see if those are likely to be repeated in terms of destinations flown to. And then you can review the latest legislation in terms of quarantine policies, visa requirements, health screenings, and traveler tracking of any of one of those mitigating factors that you need to inform your travelers before they embark. We also advise to review your travel policy to align with these latest legislations and in accordance with your health insurance providers and risk management team. Ensure full compliance to track travelers through your TMC by ensuring that any expense claims made outside of the travel management company are not reimbursed. We also advise to negotiate deals with your suppliers. It may not be the best possible time, as they've recommended, to seek discounts, as we're not forecasting that there will be major discounting across the industry. But looking at incentives in regards to the vouchers that you have, being able to transfer the name on those as they're currently tied to the name of the traveler. You also want to seek more flexible policies in relation to cancellations, refunds, and change fees. You may wish to request rebates and other incentives, such as greater loyalty points and upgrades for your travelers. And whenever there's any kind of an economic downturn, we see greater innovation. So work with your travel management company and keep your ear to the ground in terms of the innovations, particularly in the field of risk mitigation and traveler tracking and employee well-being.
So I hope you found that useful today. We feel face-to-face meetings play a vital role in business growth. It's outlasted technological enhancements and previous global events. According to research by Economics, a leader in global forecasting, a 10% increase in business travel volumes boosts revenue by 0.5%. Also, a 10% increase in trade increases productivity growth by 1%. However, travel will evolve. The definition of an essential business travel will have greater scrutiny and will now require businesses to put in even greater auditing measures in relation to return on investment, health screening, and safety. Advice to travel managers is to stay informed both externally in terms of legislation and risk, but also internally with traveller health and confidence, whilst also being given greater advance notice of forthcoming trips and events where possible. Here at Grey Doors, we're working hard on a series of innovations to improve the duty of care advice to corporates and travellers so they'll feel confident when travel restrictions are lifted. Stay tuned to our Working From Home blog, which you'll find on our website, where every week we're publishing an eclectic mix of articles to help you get through the current situation. Thank you.